Okay, the post-Cold War era. This is actually the winding down of the Soviet Union in the last 2 or 3 years of the Soviet Union's existence. All of the events you can see on this screen in this slide occurred during the administration of George H.W. Bush, the father of uh, our president, 2 presidents ago, 3 presidents ago if you include Trump, George W. Bush. Once again, as I said about Eisenhower being a transitional, not transformational president, George H.W. Bush can be seen in the same context. Transitional, not transformational necessarily. Transitional in the sense that Reagan, particularly for Republicans, they really hit Truman on the loss of China still. They really hit even if the containment idea was successful or practical, they really hit home the concept of Reagan building up arms in order to bankrupt the Soviet Union, right? And really pushing for enough containment. Let's just extinguish this regime in Russia, right? Having said that, his successor, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, was the one who was president of the United States when the Berlin Wall came down and when Gorbachev relinquishes control of Russia to Boris Yeltsin, and the Soviet Union eventually collapses and the Cold War is over, right? And he, around that same time, is going to have a war. We're going to have a war with Iraq, the first one, and so George H.W. Bush is going to be very popular at the time. One-term president, though. He had been Ronald Reagan's vice president for the CIA, had been the CIA's director from, I believe, 71 and 1972. So this is stuff that happens during his presidency. Obviously he's the vice president of Ronald Reagan, so not transitional in the same way as we saw Eisenhower as a completely different political party, right? He's not of the same party as Truman. He's not Truman's handpicked successor or whatever, Not that George H.W. Bush was Reagan's handpicked successor, but he is his vice president. And he doesn't all of a sudden say, well, let's fundamentally shift in our strategy or in our tactics here with the Cold War. He, maintains the same sort of policies and as basically presides over the United States as the Cold War officially ends. A very substantial situation. So let's look at these. In 1989, April of 89, spring, summer of 89, you have student protests in Beijing, in China. There have been economic reforms, and there have been attempts at reform in China throughout the 80s. There's a lot of anxiety over a lack of democracy, a lack of freedoms in China that culminate with massive student protests, student-initiated protests in China. And in Beijing, in a specific place in Beijing called Tiananmen Square, right, public square, public gatherings, thousands and thousands of demonstrators, right, publicly, in the streets declaring a desire for more democracy, more transparency in government, and the government responds by opening fire on them, basically shooting at them. Hundreds, possibly thousands, die in what's known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Did I say that right? Tiananmen Square Massacre. It's also known as that's how it's known throughout the world. In the U.S., in China, it's known as the June 4th Massacre or June 4th Movement, because it was, like I said, it's, beginning in April, but through the summer of '89. This is really the iconic sort of event as far as when we think of China and government repression, right? People, the average American, if they know anything about China over the last 20, 30 years, if they were going to cite some sort of human rights abuse, they would say Tiananmen Square or Tibet or both. So, and initially the government in Beijing is going to come out and say, well, these student demonstrators were it was just counter-revolutionary, pro-Western, counter-revolutionary, subversive, in a similar way that like you look at World War I and how labor unions and various groups are targeted. The Black Panthers during Vietnam are targeted for national security reasons, right? They're a threat to national security. The way we use the term national security, Soviet or communist regimes will tend to use the term counter-revolutionary, which sometimes it's, yeah, they probably are counter to the revolution that you want. They're not communists. They don't like your totalitarian style of government. Maybe they want to overthrow it. In a lot of instances, though, you have people who are artists and poets and musicians who are targeted, because they're somehow represent a threat to the existing government. So that's, yeah, there's not going to really be a level of government repression as substantial and as explosive and sudden as Tiananmen Square in China, really, after that. It's not to say that they have a plus on human rights or anything, or individual freedom, but yeah, that's a very memorable moment for folks as far as in November of '89, later on that year, at the end of that year, the Berlin Wall comes down, right? This is the Berlin, Germany. It's the middle of Europe. It's where the Russians, who were allies, met the British, American, French forces, Canadian forces who were allies, and really where this East-West Iron Curtain Cold War thing began, where they met in the middle, right? And this wall symbolized an attempt by East Berlin, behind the Iron Curtain, to keep people on their side, because before the wall went up in 1961, originally it was barbed wire fencing, and then they put a permanent structure in. You had 1,000 people a day on average, they say, trying to get into West Berlin, leave East Berlin. Right, so this wall had stood for 28 years, right? I mean, not the exact same structure, right? There was barbed wire and then connecting various other fences and making the substantial concrete thing that comes down November of '89. Coincidentally, November is the month that the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, took power, right? November of 1917. It's referred to as Red October, but that's because the Russian calendar, the old Russian calendar, was off by a month, or was different than the one we use today. So they thought they called it October, but for everyone else it was November. So yeah, that's substantial. That's really if you look at where the East lines up with the West, that's ground zero, and it's the separate, the Soviet sort of wall, wall representing sort of Soviet resistance to people being able to access the West being able to access them, comes down. And then the following month, the United States invades Panama. Did you guys know about this? The United States invades Panama Christmas Eve, 1989, or Christmas Day. I believe upwards of 3,000 Panamanians are killed in this